good morning, and welcome to the third part of our leadership series on leading through uncertainty, responding to critical leadership questions. And if you're joining us today, you've probably been with us for the last two parts of this series, whether it be here in person or watching via recording. But today we have another two amazing panelists that I'm thrilled to be speaking with, and we have some questions again that we have compiled from members of our community, and we'll be getting answers from these panelists regarding these questions. But I want to first take a moment to thank those of you who have written in. This series, as it nears its conclusion in its current format, has only been possible because of the questions that have been coming in and the genuine curiosity to seek answers. And so thank you to all those who have sent those in over the last couple of weeks. But I want to introduce our two panelists today because, as I mentioned, we have two fantastic ones that I'm so thrilled were able to join us. Mostly because they are extremely busy individuals, two of the most busy individuals I know. And so the fact that they took some time out of their morning to help us is tremendous. The first panelist that we have this morning is Dr. Kristen Lucas. She is the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Business and Associate Professor in the Management Department. She began her work in administration as an Assistant Dean of Program Innovation and Strategic Initiatives for the College of Business at U of L after creating an award-winning and internationally recognized business communication curriculum. She earned her master's degrees and PhD in organizational communication from Purdue University, and she recently won the Meta Gibbs Outstanding Teacher Scholar Award from the Association of Business Communication in 2019. Kristen, welcome and thank you for joining us.
So good to be here. Good morning, everyone.
Our second panelist is Dr. Kathy Gosser, who retired from KFC Yum Brands in 2019 after 35 years of service with the company. She left as the Director of Learning and Organizational Development and Chair of the KFC Foundation. She also held leadership positions in customer satisfaction programs and operations measurement. The College of Business was lucky to welcome her as a full-time member of our institution as an executive in residence and faculty member in the management department, where she now oversees the college's franchise management certificate. Kathy also holds an MBA and PhD in educational leadership and organizational development from U of L. Kathy, good morning and welcome.
Thanks, great to be here.
Well, thank you both again for being here, and we'll just jump right into it. As you know, we have a series of questions here that have been submitted previously, but we do certainly encourage, for those of you who are here in the live room, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat feature or even comments, suggestions, extensions of our panelists' thoughts. We welcome there in the chat, and we'll have time for some Q&A, of course, at the end of this session. But I'll go with our first question here, and it's a fairly straightforward one. At least it jumps right into the content. It says, the last 2 months have truly been an emotional roller coaster for me and my staff. What can we do as leaders to reestablish some stability while still being subject to turbulent conditions? Kristen, I'm going to start with you this morning.
Sure. So, as you said, turbulent times for everyone. And I think that some of you might be finding what is now your new normal. And so you might have some really good ideas. So please jump in and add to the chat if you want to make this a conversation. But I think one of the important things to do as a leader is to establish some sort of sense of normalcy. And even if we don't have all of the answers that are going to help people get to a feeling of security, what we can do is normalize our communication. So one of the things you can look at doing is having standing meetings with everybody at a particular day of the week or at a particular time. And these check-in meetings can become part of that new normal routine. One of the things that you can do. Another thing that you can do to establish normalcy and to create a little less turbulence is to have, of course, frequent communication. So when there's critical updates that come out, instead of holding those off for that once a week meeting, if that's what you're doing, if it's something critical, beat the news to the punch. and be the person who's communicating that information. And the third thing to do is to speak as calmly and confidently as you can. So that would be my advice.
Great. No, thank you, Kristen. Kathy, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I love what Kristen said about establishing normalcy. And I think that in these times, and the communication we'll get into, she's absolutely right on all of that. The thing that I think as a leader is to remind people why their work is meaningful and then to really appreciate that work. So getting back to, Simon Sinek has a great TED talk on what is your why. It's the golden circle. So understanding why people work, where their talents are, and really helping them focus on that versus all that's swirling around them that they can't control. Focus on what's the work that you can control and really appreciate and guide that. And that will, again, as Kristen said, drive some normalcy back into your world. But boy, being calm and having those predictable communications, that's big too.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've loved about facilitating and moderating all three of these sessions is actually seeing some of the overlap and connection of ideas between yourselves and the comments that you all just made and some of our initial panelists. And while I know that was not intentional or planned, it does really give credit to the idea that leaders are on the same page here, trying to get people back to some sense of normalcy. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like from a communication standpoint. But to see these ideas kind of coming together in a way that certainly overlaps is reassuring to me, which actually leads us to our next question. So this manager says, I oversee a dozen naturally anxious employees whose income is largely determined by sales commissions. They, like most, are concerned with the uncertainty that continues to lay ahead of us, and they often look to me for assurance. Short of a crystal ball, how should I approach these assurance-seeking situations, and what can I do to help my team get through these uncertain times? Kathy, we'll start with you on this one. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that was tough, especially if you're in sales and you have contingent income. That is a very tough place to be, and of course those folks are going to be anxious. So the first part is really establishing just the reality. These are tough times. Being authentic about it versus trying to say, oh, it's going to be better tomorrow. We don't know if it's going to be better tomorrow. So being honest with your employees is key. And I watched Patrick Lencioni, I listened to a Patrick Lencioni podcast. He talked about redefining work, and I found it fascinating. I thought it'd be a great thing to share here, but I don't want to take credit for his work. But he talks about making sure that people are doing work that fits their passion, that fits their talents. And so the salespeople, they are very talented, obviously, or they wouldn't be salespeople, so that's what they do. What can they do in these times? How can they maintain relationships with those customers to ensure those sales come later? What are tactics that they can do? The second is, there are three pieces he said are really important. The second one is that you enjoy the people you work with, that you can't wait to get back and work with them. So as a leader, what can you do to have some fun? And back at my old place, I heard they actually did a virtual scavenger hunt as a fun time. And I was really impressed with that. I thought, it lets people feel like, hey, we're back together as a team. And then the third thing he said, besides doing work that fits your talents, loving the people you work with, the third is being appreciated. And that is so simple. And I'll talk a bit about that in a few questions a little bit later, but really appreciating the work that your folks are doing and acknowledging that, even if you think, okay, I'm going a little overboard, you're probably not. I don't think you can ever appreciate or recognize people more.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. It definitely hits close to home. We've seen, you talk about the idea of pivoting and kind of repositioning what people can bring to the table. We've seen certainly here in our community, local distilleries making hand sanitizer. We've seen people really rallying to a cause, and I think that's absolutely true. Kristen, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I love what Kathy said about meaningful work and establishing the meaningfulness and that staunch acceptance of reality. And that's really two of the three things that help people be resilient. So research identifies a deeply held belief that an activity is meaningful, a staunch acceptance of reality, and the ability to practice in ritualized ingenuity. So figuring out ways of doing things different. And so I think one of the things that we can be thinking about as leaders are there short-term accommodations that you can make? And the answer to some of this might be no. But if there are things that you can do to change things up even a little bit, it might create more reassurance. So if you have staff who are on commission and they normally get paid twice a month, is it possible to do payroll weekly instead of bi-weekly? So that might be one of the accommodations that you make. I know a lot of restaurants here in town have gone to a tipping pool that's shared equally by everybody who is working in the restaurant. So there can be some small term accommodations that you make as a leader. But again, it's just that staunch acceptance of reality and taking as much emotion out of it as possible. So I think that there's a big difference between a leader who says, oh my gosh, we don't know what's going to happen. This could happen, and this could happen, and this could happen, and that can provoke additional anxiety, versus the leader who says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to assess the situation. And if this happens, here's how we'll respond. One of them evokes worry, and another of them evokes confidence. And so the more that you can just say, if this is what happens, we've got a plan for that. Or if something happens that we're not expecting, we'll make a plan for that. You don't need to know the answer. You just need to let them know that you as a leader will be creating a plan.
I think that's a perfect kind of insight there, because one thing I noticed that neither of you said, and I think it's absolutely, important that it's not recommended, is that you're not just throwing out false promises. You're not just throwing out things that you can't guarantee will happen, because that could actually create even more problems down the road and ripples of really mistrust and not having that connection of authentic honesty with your supervisor, your leaders. And so I do appreciate that both of you took that approach of how do we actually connect, but also still be, realistic and true to the situation. I think that's a really important point there. All right, so we're moving into more of the communication specific questions, which you two have years of experience and some tremendous insights on. But I want to ask you about some of these questions because some of them are very nuanced in many ways. It says here, our next question says, our leadership team unanimously agreed and followed a communication plan where our first priority was to emphasize the health, safety, and well-being of our employees and clients. Yet from there, many of us debated what additional strategies should guide our collective messaging as leaders. What factors or approaches should help guide this communication during this time beyond our focus on physical and mental well-being? And Kristen, I believe it's your turn to start on this one.
Sure. So when I teach crisis management and talk about how organizations need to respond to crisis, I always talk about having different interested groups, or in public relations, we would call them publics. You could call them key stakeholders. But each stakeholder group has its own unique concerns. So what here at the University of Louisville, what is affecting staff is a little bit different than what is affecting faculty. And that's different from what's affecting students. So each one of the stakeholder groups is unique in what its interests are. And they have both emotional needs and informational needs. And so if you can sit down and identify, okay, here are our key stakeholders, here's what they're emotionally feeling, and here's what their information is, then you can kind of come up with a better plan that addresses both of those at the same time. And then as you are identifying those informational and emotional needs, one of the things that I highly recommend is be as much of a personal touch as possible. And I know right now that's video conference for most of us versus in-person communication. But media richness is so important, because the richer the media is, if you can, face-to-face is the richest form of communication. Video communication like these Zoom calls is better than a phone call. A phone call is better than an email. So the more emotionally involved the messages, the richer your channel should be. So I always go to the richest channel possible.
So quick follow-up there, Kristen. So for those of us not familiar with media richness, what does that mean to have a rich media? Why is face-to-face, you mentioned, is the richest? Why is that? And what can you get out of a face-to-face conversation that you can't get out of, let's say, an email?
Yeah, so media richness, you can think about some messages being very thin and some being very thick, right? A text message might be one of the thinnest messages until you add smiley faces. That adds a little bit of richness, right? But email, you don't read tone, right? And so when you're on the phone call, you hear somebody's tone of voice. When you're on a Zoom call, you hear their tone of voice, you see their hand gestures, you see the expression in their face. And the more nonverbal cues you can pick up, it can change how a message is read. So instead of being read as uncaring and cold on an email, you might see somebody as warm and caring, even if it's the exact same words on a Zoom call. So the richer you can go, the better. When it is a highly potentially emotional message, or one that has contentious information in it.
Great. Kathy, what are your thoughts there? What else should be guiding some of our communication plans beyond the physical and mental well-being, the focus on those things?
I think that I've talked to several business leaders over the last few weeks, and some have just done an incredible job with the communication strategy. So when I was listening, I came up with an acronym because in the corporate world, we live and breathe by acronyms. So this one actually ended up being PACK. And you can think about, how can I pack my communication strategy? And let me spell that out. So the first one is predictable. And actually, Kristen talked about that earlier, and Virginia talked about it last week. So when your communications are predictable, when people know them when they're coming, it really gives you that cadence and that assurance that, hey, I'm going to hear from my leaders. So Virginia has everyone check in the morning, and then she does a meeting in the afternoon, which I think is pretty good to touch base. I think that's really good, actually. Our dean does a call every Friday, and I know for all the faculty and staff, we really appreciate that. A large corporation that I might have worked at does quite a few things. The CEO of a big brand does a call every other week. The company does a call every other week. The departments do a call every week. Then one-on-ones, and it may seem like a lot, but they need it. Everyone loves it. So that predictability of when that communication is coming, whatever that looks like for you, is important. The A, I've already touched on it, is authenticity. Just being honest. What's going on here? Here's where we're at. Here's what I can tell you. Here's what I can't. That is really critical. C is consistency. And Kristen talked about this too. Being calm, not one day being crazy, one day being calm. And if you think about, all of us have probably had a supervisor in the past where you'll ask somebody, what kind of mood is he or she in? Well, we don't have the luxury to be in a mood right now. As leaders, our mood needs to be calm and reassuring. So you've got predictable, authentic, and consistent, and the last one is kind. There's always room for kindness with everyone, especially right now, because everyone's on edge. So just remembering in your communication strategy and when you're talking to people with kindness. And what is nice about, and I love what Kristen said about the richness of the communication, that can come through in Zoom calls, Teams calls, whatever medium you use. That does come through much better than a text or an email or a phone call. So that's it.
Absolutely. No, and I know me, you, and Kristen have all been on some of those calls on Friday. And as far as the predictability of this goes, the first of your acronym there, I haven't told either of you this, but I actually start to plan my Fridays around that particular conversation, right? So I typically mow Friday mornings, but I have to make sure that I'm done by the afternoon. So we start to develop patterns around communication and certain events. And I think that does provide some of that stability that some of our first writers were asking about as well, to try to create that some sense of normalcy there. So that actually leads us into our next question, though, because we don't want to overdo it. And I think there's a fine line of when is too much, how much is too much. And that's really what the essence of this next question is. It says, we've been working remotely for nearly 2 months, yet my group is struggling with some collaborative projects. Individually, I trust my people, but how often should I be checking in with my team, and how should I be doing this? So we talked a little bit about the video and text already, but how often should I be checking in with my team to ensure optimal team performance? Kathy, let's start with you on this one.
You know, this one's interesting because I know we've all had what we would consider a micromanager, which means they're checking in every single minute. What are you doing? And actually, a colleague of mine from another place said that she actually, her boss calls her nonstop, and they use Slack. And so her boss will call her over her computer, and she feels she has no privacy, and she's finding it intrusive and quite rude. So she's pretty upset about it. Others have their supervisors checking in at different times, like a morning, evening, as Virginia talked about, which is a bit more predictable. So there's a balance. And then I also heard on the radio that software developers are working on software where they can take a screenshot of what you're doing every 5 seconds. Okay, I was a bit mortified by that because that does feel intrusive. But you have to find a balance on how can you check in. And it really depends upon, I think it depends upon where each employer, each group is. Some groups or some employees can work totally self-sufficiently and require very little check-in, just keep you updated weekly. Some do require a daily. So as a leader, it's important that you know your team so you know what it's going to take. But I would admonish from actually over checking in because it can feel that you don't trust. And that can be an issue. Now, if you have deliverables and you have timelines and they're not being met, that almost gives you the right to go ahead and check in more. But I think that piece is something I would have a conversation with my team and say, these are different times. We're working on this project. How often do you want me to check in? And what can I expect? What are the key milestones? And from there, if they're hit, you can follow that path. If they're not, then you have to take a different tactic and actually check in a bit more. But that's my take on it.
Absolutely. Kristen, what are your thoughts?
I'm just going to add one thought here. Maybe it's a little bit from personal experience, but I feel, and I don't know if you all feel like this, but I want people to start using the word ZOOMbie. It's kind of like when you've been on Zoom for so long that you turn into a zombie. And it kind of has this like glazed eyes, like hunched shoulders, kind of like, you're on mute. No, you're not on mute. I can't hear. Yeah. And so whatever you do, like Kathy said, don't over communicate. The right number of times, the right amount of time is all going to be dependent upon the individual, of course. It may reflect a little bit more of how often you check in with that person before the pandemic. But whatever you do, just try to keep those Zoom calls to that critical minimum, so people just don't leave at the end of the day over Zoomed.
No, I've certainly seen my fair share of Zoom fatigue articles starting to pop up and seeing the effects on my own life, just being in front of a screen for a long period of time. So I certainly agree with that. So I'm going to pause from our list of questions here because we did get one in the chat that I think is really related to what we're talking about here. And so this comes from Tony. Hello, Tony. It's good to see you, by the way. So Tony says, kind of summarizing some of the things we've talked about, it's important obviously to be mindful of our team's well-being, conveying concern and authenticity, but what are some of the management skills that are unique right now to managing telework teams? And what can we do to kind of build up those skills either for ourselves or for our fellow managers? And Kathy, let's go to you on that one. Let's start there.
That's a great question. I think the first thing is to have a platform where you can have common documents and you would do your calls out of chat, etc. Many of us leverage Teams, but some use Google Docs. But just having some type of platform where you can collect your materials, and that's a pretty tactical response there. But it is really, really important to have at least one spot to do that. I think that when it comes to what are the skills, again, not overdoing it, not over managing, but you'll hear me go back to this appreciation over and over, but also appreciating the work, because remember, people are working remotely. The only people they have around them is probably their family, and their family's not going to understand the depth and scope of the work they're doing, but you as their leader, you do. So the more you note it, even if you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm overdoing this, on the positive side, it's worth it. People need it. They will absolutely grab onto that. I know I have a chair who is very, very vocal on his appreciation, and it means the world to me. Our deans do as well, and that is definitely very motivating. So I think that that's important. So having the platform, having the predictable communications, packing your communications as we talked about, but then really driving up that appreciation. And then the last one is being available, letting your team know you are available to them. And if you want them to text you, so it's not quite so disruptive, but just being there for them and responding quickly to them. I think those are very important key attributes to have.
Kristen, other thoughts there for Tony's question regarding management skills right now to help manage telework teams?
I'll add two more. One of them is motivating. And this kind of goes along with that trust component. You know, a lot of people are really doing their best at this, but it can get really hard some days. And you probably know this, because you're working from home. And there are certain days that you get up and you think, I just don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this. And being tuned in enough to your staff that you can figure out when people need motivation. And even if that motivation comes from saying, like, take 3 hours off and go for a long walk or sit out and get some sunshine, and then come back to it. So I think some flexibility and motivation to keep the work going while attending to the human being doing the work is going to be really critical. And then I think that it also requires a higher level of multitasking skills than we have seen before. When I was working on campus, I would have meetings back to back to back. But because I was on campus, back to back also usually required a 10-minute walk to get from one building to another building across campus. And so I would leave 10 minutes before the meeting. I had that 10-minute walk and some fresh air. I had my meeting. I had the 10-minute walk to come back where I could decompress, where I could sort out what needed to happen. Now in this Zoom-rich environment, my meetings are scheduled with no break between them. So I can go from an 8 to 9 meeting to a 9 to 10 meeting to a 10 to 10:30 to a 10:30 to 12, as I'm sure all of you are doing. And there's no downtime between those meetings to gather your thoughts, to figure out what needs to be done. And it just requires so much more diligence on that multitasking to get the work done.
I think those are both great points. And one thing, we had Nat Irvin on in the first session for this, talking about Kathy's point about appreciation. He highlighted, and it's old but true, the importance of little things, right? The handwritten card that you can still send out, and the mail system still works. You can get that to your people as a way of showing appreciation. But to continue with your point there, Kristen, about thinking about how we structure our time, I've seen some managers actually choose to end meetings specifically at 8:50 or 9:50 or 10:50 to give some of that time back to employees. And I think that's another great strategy as well, just to kind of recognize that, we're not just, pinballs bouncing from one Zoom room to another. We might be right now, but it's not ideal and it's not, best strategy. So I think both of those two things are really hitting home, as well as this next question, because this is one that shifts gears a little bit, and certainly the tone of this shifts quite significantly, but the importance is maybe continuing to rise here. So sadly, I have been getting more practice at delivering bad news lately. I struggle a lot with this. I've led many teams, and I know this is always part of the job, but much of the bad news I have delivered lately is not the fault of any one person or any particular decision. What is the best way to deliver bad news? And how can I do this constructively but fairly with respect to my people? Kristen, let's start with you on this one.
One of my favorite authors who has been writing about delivering bad news is Kim Scott. She wrote a book called Radical Candor. And the premise, I think, just rings true. And it's stuff that I have thought for a long time, but never had such a catchy phrase to turn it into a bestseller. But it's the idea that you lead with caring deeply, and then you just, in a lot of cases, hers is about corrective feedback. She calls it challenging directly, but then coming out with the bad news. If people know that you care, I think that it makes it much more manageable to deliver that message. And yeah, it's exhausting. And I too have been the bearer of bad news. I feel that that is my new job as of these last couple months, is to be the bad news messenger. And so, yeah, it's exhausting. And I would say start by caring deeply, delivering that news. Think back to media richness. If you can do it with a rich context instead of a thinner context, that is going to be more meaningful, because people are going to feel that care. They may wipe away the care that you typed a message, but they'll hear it in your voice. And the one other piece I would say is about you, is make sure that you have a support network going, whether it's friends that you have a happy hour with, or a loved one at home, or just some way to get emotional support, because the person who delivers the bad news, that's just as tough of a job as receiving it sometimes. So make sure that you also have the support that you need.
No, I think that's extremely powerful, and it's something that does often go overlooked. We think of bad news as something that only affects, one person or a group of people, but in reality, bad news is bad news. It's affecting both sides of the communication chain, and I think that's something that we have to keep into consideration. Kathy, what are your thoughts?
And actually, I'm really happy that Kristen ended with that part about have a support system away from that person. Because one of the worst things you can do is, when you're delivering bad news, compare it to bad news you've had or something that's happening to you. Because at that point, that person could care less about you. It's really not about you. It's about them. But then when you go away, you do need the support. So I think that's an important part to realize, is that she said, when you have your support system back home, not there. And I think probably all of us who've been in business for a while have had bad news delivered in a way to us where somebody airs their own grievance. Well, hey, let me tell you what happened to me one time. Or the bad news is minimized. For example, your furlough is for X weeks. Hey, it could be this many weeks, so at least it's only this. There's no minimizing bad news. It is what it is. And it's also okay to be authentic and say, I'm really sorry, and this is really tough. But then allow the person time and space to talk or not. That I would not force. I never force anyone to talk through it. Some people want to, and some people don't. But starting with the caring is so important, knowing it's not about you, just delivering the news, and then getting your own support system away from that person. Those are great tips.
No, I agree with you there, Kathy, and especially on the minimizing part, because I think that's a natural tendency. We're drawn to that. We want to try to make it as least bad as possible, but in doing so, we sometimes can really make it worse, because we're saying, look, we don't think this is that bad, or we don't assume that you're experiencing some real pain from this, when in reality that may very well not be true. And so,
because we don't know, we have no idea what people's lifestyles are like, what their financials are like, anything. We have no idea. So to minimize it at all, even a day to some people could be devastating. So, and then there's the mental part. Sometimes we also think, well, if we can get the financials fixed, so if they get this and this, they'll be okay financially. Sometimes it's not a financial issue. Sometimes it's mental, as in, am I not good enough? Why was I chosen for the furlough or the layoff? Oh my gosh, is it me? And so we as leaders try to think, well, it's a financial situation. Typically it's not.
Yeah.
So the minimizing, I think, is not to do that is important.
Absolutely. And again, I'm drawn back to some of our previous panelists and some of the things that have been brought up about empathy and compassionate leadership. And so I definitely see some connections there, and hopefully this series has been connecting those points in various ways. So I want to move into our next question, because Kathy, you actually talked a little bit about furloughs, and we've had a few questions over the last couple of weeks about layoffs and some of these really difficult situations that our leaders are finding themselves in right now. But it says, my organization announced a series of furloughs several weeks ago. We hope to bring our full team back soon, but we do not have a definitive date on when this will happen. What advice do you have for communicating with a furloughed team during this time? Things to do or avoid? And so, Kathy, we'll start with you and then go into Kristen's comments as well.
I'll let Kristen handle the legal aspects of it, because in her role, I'll let her handle that this time. But I will just say, when people are furloughed or laid off or whatever happens, there's no need to shun them. And I have seen that happen. I've seen people laid off, and the folks that are left behind it's almost like a shunning. And I think it's because they have survivor's guilt. They're not sure what to do. They're not sure if they should reach out. And again, Kristen's going to handle part of this, but if the email is still available, there's nothing wrong with saying how you doing, thinking about you. They're not required to respond. So, I mean, I think that there's nothing wrong with being compassionate and kind and letting folks know that you're thinking about them. But Kristen, I'm going to pop that one to you.
Well, so I don't know all of the legality as much as our HR folks do, but the one thing that I do know is that we are not allowed to send any kind of work email, not even like here's something for your to-do list when you get back. They are not working, so there should be no work emails at all. Kathy said, don't shun them. So one of the questions that came up for us, because we're going through furloughs at U of L, is some people said, does this mean that my email account is being shut down? And we said, no, it's not being shut down, because some people do have listservs or accounts or people who that's the email that, even though we all know that work email is work email and you should have a personal email, we do know that people will give out their work email and have friends and family contact them. So we didn't shut down their emails. So they're still available to do that. One of the things that we did is we asked to pull together a list of text numbers so we could text out an alert, because some people said, I don't want to be checking my email every day when I'm on furlough. I don't want to be looking for key messages. But if something comes out, if the president makes a big announcement, or if and by president they meant the president of the university makes a big announcement, if there's some sort of update that affects my employment, I want to know, but I don't want to be checking. And so what we did is we created a text alert group that says that there's been an email update from the president that you may want to see. It's in your inbox. So that's one way that you could keep them in the loop. Another thing that we've done, and something you could consider doing, is creating a Facebook group. So we have a College of Business faculty staff, and is it called faculty and staff or faculty staff and friends? But people can belong to that Facebook group, and it's purely social. People are posting photos of their dogs, they're posting jokes. Sometimes they're posting news articles of people who've been in the news about their research, or have had some sort of accomplishment. They're sharing happy birthday messages. So use those social media tools. A group like that could be a way to keep people connected socially to their coworkers and retain that sense of community, but keep them separated from those work emails.
I think that's really powerful, Kristen. I like what you said about just the resource of the text chain. I think that's just an easy way of implementing, a communication process to at least keep them involved on critical things that will affect them after furloughing is completed. But you're absolutely right. You don't want to add to, anxieties or pressures of here's all the things building up for you when you get back. I don't think that's beneficial at all, and I think you definitely addressed that. I also want to bring in Kathy's comment, though, that certainly on the personal side, for those of us who have personal relationships with people who have been furloughed, reaching out on that personal level, checking in, I think is certainly an appropriate and a great thing to do, just to make sure that your colleagues are doing all right, that you can help them if you can in any way. That's certainly a resource that is not work specific, but certainly something that you can do for your colleagues that in this time may be greatly appreciated. So moving into our next series of questions, and so we went into a little bit of a dark place there. Now we're starting to come out on the other side here of some of the positive questions. It says, I work in a large distribution plant that has maintained operations throughout most of this crisis. There are a lot of commercials and public figures that have expressed thanks to people like us, but how can I, as their manager, show genuine and authentic appreciation and recognition to my workers during these times? And it notes here as well, he or she, especially since I'm extremely limited with respect to resources like bonuses. And so what are some other things that either can be said or done to help show authentic appreciation and recognition? And I'm blanking on who's to go first this time, so I'm going to choose Kathy here to go first.
All right, well, this might be my favorite question out of all that all that were presented. So there are a couple different ways, and I'm going to talk about if you're in person or if you're remote. This one reads as if they're in person, and I get the limited funds. And the good news is that the recognition that's the most effective doesn't cost anything. Because if you ask people, how effective was that bonus you got in appreciation for work you did? What was really great the day you got it? When was it no longer great? When I spent it. I've asked class after class that, and when I would train back at KFC, the same thing. The bonus lasts as long as until it's gone. However, genuine appreciation goes a long way, and there are a couple things you can do. And Nat talked about this, a handwritten note. So back in my previous corporation, we had little note cards, and they were pre-printed. You could print them off the copy machine, and they just said, it was with our logo, why you're appreciated. The supervisor or peer would write it up and actually just say, hey, I'd like to recognize Zac, and read it off and clap. That was it. But that card meant so much. So back in 2001, I was running KFC restaurants, and I gave one of these cards to a 16-year-old. Well, he now works at our help desk. He's kept that card all these years. So he has kept that card 19 years. And when I retired, he told me about that. So I think that that demonstrates how important it is. Just having a one-on-one with someone, asking them how they're doing, and then being very detailed and specific. Not saying something like great job, but letting them know what happened that you really appreciate them for. And a lot of times doing it in front of others. Now, remotely, you have a lot of great opportunities. There are these remote card services that you could also use at a company as well. I subscribe to one online. I don't want to give a plug there, but it was like $5 a month. I can send cards electronically, and they're great. They have music and animation, and I can write my own message. I mean, that's a pretty cheap, $5 a month total is pretty cheap. The other couple things you can do is there are services around here that will deliver cookies for under $30 if you want to spend a little money. If you're in a big plant, maybe you have a little cash, you can at least do maybe a pizza party or have cookies and bring everybody together and let them know how you appreciate them. It doesn't take a whole lot, but it has to be genuine and has to be frequent. And there are folks too, one other caveat to this is, there are folks we naturally want to recognize over and over and over because they do great things. That can actually cause a fairness issue. And so people will start to resent that. So I've actually instructed people who I've worked with before and mentored, keep an Excel spreadsheet on who you've recognized. And maybe you say, I'm going to recognize 1 or 2 people a week. Make sure you're spreading that recognition equally. That is very, very important with that sense of equity. So some people are very focused on an Excel spreadsheet. Use it to your advantage. Put it on your calendar. You're going to recognize someone today, whatever it takes, but it will go a long way.
I love that.
I've talked enough.
That's the first I've heard of a recognition spreadsheet, but I love it. And I think that's something that a lot of people could implement today and have some success with. Great. So Kristen, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I just want to add what Kathy said, mentioned a little bit about being specific. I think specific is really important because, it's really easy, and I'll go back to an in-person event. It would have been really easy after this event to tell the event planners, oh, you did a great job. The event was really terrific. But I took a little bit more time and said, your speakers were engaging, your whatever was going on. And I remember talking about the food that they had. And I said, your food was so colorful. And they just lit up. They said, we did that intentionally. We wanted all the food to look like a rainbow. And so it was letting them know that you're really paying attention. And and if it goes into a written note, a printed certificate that could be sent out later, and to really create some fanfare. I know we did some staff recognition awards here every year, and we would just announce the winner. And what I did last year is I changed it up a little bit, and I read a couple excerpts from the nominations and then said, and the winner is. And just the amount of energy that created compared to just announcing the winner was enormous. So that free fanfare, take advantage of it. And that can happen on Zoom as well.
Absolutely. And so if you didn't notice it already, for those of you who are in the room watching the recording, both of these two individuals practice what they preach. Kristen just shared her example, and being in the room at that time as she was describing, certainly a powerful moment for the recipient, but also those who worked with the recipient to get to see that recognition play out was definitely important. And Kathy, I don't know if you're comfortable with me sharing this, I hope that you are, but Kathy has sent me and the panelists the last couple of weeks from our previous panels an email after each one has concluded where she just summarizes her thoughts and what she liked about it. And I can tell you that those have been two of the greatest emails that I've received over the last couple of weeks for sure, and have definitely been highlights of my week. So, you know, both of these two individuals, not just, you know, throwing out ideas, certainly trying to implement them, and credit to both of them for doing so. All right, so as we start to shift toward the latter portion of our discussion here, and I am starting to see a few more comments in the discussion that I'll get to, the chat that I'll get to in just a moment. But as we look ahead a little bit, a question from one of our writers says, I work predominantly in a customer-facing industry that is just now slowly showing signs of life. What advice do you have to re-engage our consumers and encourage future business? And Kristen, I believe it's your turn, so we'll start with you on this one.
Well, I think that, I'm pausing here for a moment because I just read an article on this morning, and now it was on Fast Company, it was in my news feed, and I thought, oh, they have great advice, and I didn't commit it to memory. So Fast Company has an article out there. But I think that there's sort of a kind of a phase of customers trying to figure out how to engage as a consumer. So I think about even myself. For a while, I was just acting like it was business as usual. And for me, I eat out a lot, and I would call up places and go to make an order, and they'd say, okay, that can be ready in 3.5 hours. And so I think that to a certain extent, part of the role of engaging customers and talking about future business is inviting them back, making them, just like your employees, feel a new sense of normal, and teaching them how to engage with you, especially, you know, in that customer-facing industry. Depending on if it's a high contact industry or not, there's going to be new rules, there's going to be new ways of doing things. This can feel really scary. It can feel like this isn't the business that I used to work with. And so I think just letting them know that you care and helping to teach them so they're comfortable with the new normal, whatever your routine is in your business, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, no, I agree that the comfort side of this is key, I think, because full disclosure, I live over on the Indiana side of the river, and they've opened things up a little faster. And I know many of my neighbors and friends have felt kind of uncomfortable so far, and thus their business has been slow to come back. Just so building that comfort, I think, is definitely a huge key, and we can do so not just through our policies and practices, but how we communicate those as well. Kathy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think what companies are doing right now is laying the groundwork for their future business, and in a couple different ways. One is how they're talking to their customers. So when you think about companies that are saying, here's how we're being safe for you, here's what we're doing. And I know I obviously subscribe to some restaurant newsletters, and those restaurants are talking about, we're changing gloves after every order, we're wearing these masks, et cetera, we're putting up this plexiglass. So that's a big message now in how we feel about you. But to me, what's even more important right now is how companies are treating their employees. And you can see it everywhere. There's a large grocery chain that has billboards all around the city saying, we appreciate our teams. That means a lot to me. There are companies that are giving, I have a friend that works for a payroll company, they're giving every employee an extra $1,000 on their check. I'll give KC, my own KC plug, they gave team members that needed it a $50 grocery gift card. They just had to apply. I mean, they had like 5,000 of these to give away. What people are doing for their employees says a lot. And people talk, we hear that.
Now that's kind of face to face. There are also, I think about my husband has a small business, and what he's done is he has reached out to his customers to just say, hey, I'm not coming during this time. Are you okay? Do you have any issues? Anything I need to know about? So he has maintained contact with them. So he's poised and ready to go back full force. So I think you can continue relationships, how you treat your customers now and the experiences they're receiving, but how you treat your employees, because that says a lot about who you are as a company and what you value.
Absolutely. And I would go back to something that Brad Shuck said in our first panel of legacy, and how these couple of months and this period of time will ultimately be a huge contributing factor in our companies and our organization's legacy, and that people will remember these events much more strongly than they do other, more normal times. And so I think your points are spot on, as well as Kristen's, that we have to be very careful and very strategic in how we're addressing both our customers, but also our employees, because there's certainly some interrelated ideas going on there. All right, last question here as far as looking ahead, but I think this is an important one. It's very much open-ended, but I'm curious to see where this conversation concludes. And that is, what are some of the additional opportunities that may directly or indirectly come from this crisis? It's something that we've asked each of our panelists to some extent so far, but any opportunities, whether they be communication related, management related, what are some things that you envision coming? And how can leaders begin to strategize or leverage these opportunities to help themselves and to help their organizations going forward? Kristen, let's start with you on this one.
Well, when I think about resilience, and that's what surviving this crisis about, is resilience. Resilience is this ability to adapt to our new normal. And the great thing, I think, like if there's something good to be had here, it's that we get to create that new normal. So when I walk around my neighborhood, I see things and I think, I hope that stays. Like, I hope that doesn't go away when we go back to business as usual. And so if there's things about work-life balance or healthy habits or anything that you can create within your culture right now, I think that now's the opportunity. So for me, working at home, it's easier without the commute to get out and do a walk in the middle of the afternoon. And maybe that's a personal choice, but maybe as an organization, can you be thinking about how do you create more opportunities for health and work-life balance for your employees? How do you find ways to be more compassionate to people? So one of the things that has occurred here at University of Louisville is we've said that this is a semester of compassion and flexibility for our students. Why can't every semester be a semester where we have just a little bit more compassion and flexibility than usual? So I would say just think about the things, those bright spots, and the things that you like about how things are operating right now, and find a way to hang on to those so you don't lose them after the crisis is over.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. Kathy, what are your thoughts?
I like that work-life balance perspective, Kristen. That was really good. Learn from that. So when I thought about what opportunities, if I think about what opportunities in work are available, anytime you have a crisis, and Virginia talked about this last week, it gives you a chance to experiment, because people are more open to allow you to try experiments. So how can you do your work differently? So in higher ed, we had to quickly pivot to an online platform. So that's given us the ability, and I have an experiment I want to do this fall that I've already talked to Kristen in my chair about, and they're like, well, yeah. And they might have said that anyway, but the fact that we're in the middle of this crisis, I just think it gives you a chance to think about what can be. There are companies that will spring up we never thought of. For example, they're writing articles about Zoom. They're doing backgrounds for Zoom. How can you check in on your employees with Zoom? So there are all those new opportunities that are opening up that no one even thought about. And now, even if you go and you look for articles, it's incredible how much is about this crisis and managing and leading. And so all that opens up opens up doors. So thinking about in your world, what are you doing differently that you want to stick? Or what do you think could be another revenue stream or a motivator for your employees, a way to retain your team? What skills have you learned about yourself? Whether that's, I'm better if I walk, which I am. I'm better if I exercise every day, or I'm better, whatever that is for you, whatever is available to you. I think that learning from it is the most important part. And one of the things I want to reiterate, because it was my big learning last week as from Virginia, is when you experiment, then sit back and say, what did I learn? And where do I want to go forward? So if we look at this whole working at home, this whole situation is a huge experiment. What did we learn, and what do we want to take with us? And what do we just want to say, let's not remember that. But what are the things that we want to take forward? So that's, I think that there's a ton of opportunity now. It's in the way that we look at it.
Absolutely. And just to echo your comments there, Kathy, the last 3 months of higher education, I've seen more changes and more evolution in some ways than I've seen in the 10 years that I've been a part of it. And so, to ignore some of those things is completely impossible. And I think you can either choose to kind of stay away from it or try to hide from it, or embrace it and run with it. And so I think those who can do that and do so in a respectable but responsible way are going to be positioned to succeed after and going forward. So my last question to both of you then is just more or less a summary of some of your main takeaways from this conversation. I want to get maybe just a brief reflection on what stands out to you the most from this conversation. And one of the things I've been asking all of our panelists to conclude with is one specific thing, a strategy, a suggestion. It can be related to something we've said today, or it can be completely unrelated, that you recommend for our current participants, those in the room with us today, but also for those who are watching the recording later on. So one quick reflection and one quick recommendation. And Kathy, let's start with you on this one.
All right, so I'll go back to the acronym about how you should build your communication strategy, since that's what we were focused on. Being predictable, authentic, consistent in your tone, and being kind. I think you've heard a lot about passion and kindness, compassion and kindness, and we really need that during these days, for sure. So, and my advice is, what I always go back to, it's recognizing and appreciating all the work in a specific manner that is being done around you, your colleagues. Even there's nothing ever wrong with appreciating ever. Some people have another word for it, but I do think that appreciating your leaders, they need it too.
Absolutely. Kristen?
I think if I was going to summarize my comments, I would say that communication is absolutely vital to managing any kind of crisis. And it really is the thing that's going to hold your organization together, and it's going to heal your employees and help them build resilience. And so I guess that would be my key summary, is that frequent, regular communication, like Kathy said, that is compassionate and kind, is really where it's at for moving the organization forward. And then in terms of a takeaway, what I would want people to do is, maybe spend 30 minutes and kind of map out, in an ideal world, if I wasn't so very rushed, what would my weekly communication plan to my team look like? And try to map that out and see if you can't start living that plan.
I think that's really powerful. I think both of your comments today have been spot on. And I do just appreciate, again, you taking some time out of your morning to help answer these questions. This has been an enlightening 3-part series for me, at least, to help moderate and oversee this process. As I've said frequently, I don't pretend to know all the answers, but I'm fortunate enough to work with really smart people who often know a lot of the answers. And so I can definitely say that has been the case in these panels. And thank you both for being a part of this.
Thank you. Zach appreciated it.
All right, well, that concludes our 3-part series. If you do have any questions that weren't answered as part of this series, please feel free to reach out to our executive education team. Their information will be linked to this video once we do finally post it. But I do want to thank them for helping to coordinate and to put this together. I want to thank all of our panelists who have been a part of this. And I also want to thank those of you who are in this room at this time. Your comments through the chat, but also I know many of you have contributed to the actual questions, have been extremely helpful. And we hope that we've been able to provide some answers for them during these uncertain times. Until then, I thank all of you for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.